Friendship is a funny thing. The dynamics that people can fall into are many and uniquely complex. Some people have very intimate and comforting relationships. Others center around humor or the ability to have fun together. The point is, no two friendships are alike, and the things that bring people together can be just about anything. So I'd like to introduce you to one particular friendship that is unlike any I have ever seen before. It's not built on mutual understanding or shared interests or a respect for one another. In fact, it seems like every person in this friend group actively hates and is out to get every other person. And yet, they never seem to leave each other or seriously seek out any other group. And why? Well, you could claim it's something like codependence, or that there are no other options, or simply that each and every member of this group is fully and undeniably insane. And there's a lot of information to back those theories up. However, I found another explanation that I like more, and much like these very characters would, I've decided that the explanation I like is more important than the explanation that is probably true. The group that I'm talking about is the staff of the fictional Irish bar known as Paddy's Pub from the hit FX series It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The gang, as they're often called, is made of twin bartenders Dee and Dennis Reynolds, their estranged, kind of, father Frank Reynolds, semi-closeted security man Ronald McDonald, yes, that's his real name, and their janitor/rat basher Charlie Kelly. The group have a number of other acquaintances and enemies, more so the latter, but for the majority of the time we spend with them, they seem content spending time with only each other. Now, without getting too deep into the actual point before introducing it, each of the characters I just listed deal with a number of truly insane and awful circumstances, most of which, again, are the direct result of the actions of one or more members of the group, not mentioning the many, many times that the results are simply the consequences of that very character's own actions. These people will be poisoned, impaled, drugged, scratched, suffocated, trampled by wild animals, abandoned in sewers, fall out windows, and deal with countless other truly ridiculous punishments at the hands of the very people who they're meant to trust the most. Which leads me to that point. How could a group of people this terrible manage to stay together despite a long-running history of violence and cruelty that shows no indication of slowing down or stopping? How could a group of actual adults have so many truly insane experiences and yet never seem to learn from them? How could the owners of Paddy's Pub piss so many people off, break so many laws, and cause so much damage to themselves and the world, and yet still be allowed to walk freely, wreaking havoc on themselves and everything around them, but most of all, themselves? Well, it's simple. There's a rational answer for all of this. Today's video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. As someone who spends all day writing, recording, and editing at my computer, when I go to sleep, I need a break from all the lights and LEDs. Unfortunately, with my ADHD, even the smallest bit of light can be super distracting and interrupt my sleep. That's why I use Manta, and I really mean that. Before Manta even reached out to me for a sponsorship, I'd been using their original sleep mask for years. The mask is super comfortable and blocks out light better than any mask I've ever tried. The eye coverings are comfortably shaped and adjustable, so your sleep isn't interrupted. I really enjoyed my original mask, but the folks at Manta hooked me up with an upgrade and sent me the Bluetooth-connected Sleep Mask Sound, which is super comfortable, but the best part is that it has 2 adjustable Bluetooth speakers built in that can be positioned comfortably over your ears while you sleep. It's great for planes, shared rooms, or trying to do guided meditation with zero distraction. I really love my masks, and I'm certain you will too. If you follow the link in my description and use the code BONEHEAD at checkout, you'll get 10% off of your order. It's a great way to support the channel and an even better way to get a good night's sleep. Gotta recover from the horrors somehow, right? Now, to clarify, this is not an analysis specifically of the 2-part Season 9 episode titled The Gang Goes to Hell, but that episode is of course worth mentioning off the bat. The episode is a fake-out, opening after the events of a cruise ship accident with our gang in what appears to be an empty white void, implying early on that the gang had died at some point during the story, and the narrative device through which we're hearing their story is their explanation during God's judgment. It's Always Sunny has a hilarious habit of using their episode titles as punchlines.
You guys all better eat a dick, cause Sweet D beat the system.
As soon as we learn the framework of the episode and that the gang will be judged for what they've done, the title pops in and tells us exactly what we already believe about this group of people. That they've done terrible things, and when finally faced with an irrefutable moral authority, they will get what they deserve. Except, If you've seen both of these episodes, you know it doesn't exactly work out that way. The episode hinges on a lot of biblical references and imagery, stemming mainly from the fact that the cruise the gang has been invited to is run by Mac's church, because each member individually in this story represents one of a few of the 7 deadly sins. Dennis, lust. Dee, wrath. Frank, gluttony. We'll get more into this later, but the point is, despite the fact that the story utilizes a lot of Christian imagery, it's not necessarily a story of Christianity. Sure, it's mostly about Christians, but the story doesn't necessarily prove or disprove the existence of God, or the devil, or heaven, or hell, in-universe or otherwise. The White Void is proven later to simply be a poorly lit insurance agent's office. The gang never died and just thought they were going to be arrested. The hell being referenced in the title of both episodes actually just refers to the confinement with each other the group members experienced in the later half of the episodes. But let's not discount this episode fully, as that final bit of information actually helps prove my point pretty well. At a certain point in the episode, most of which has been spent locked in an inescapable room on the cruise ship after the gang did what they do best, that being causing problems for other people, Charlie proclaims, insanely, that he believes that all of them are already dead, that they died at some point on the cruise, or maybe even on the way to it, and now they're in purgatory or on the way to hell.
Oh, I figured it out. We're dead. We died.
Dee, wrathfully, states that Charlie's wrong. Hell isn't where they're going. Hell is right here, trapped with each other, forced to suffer in captivity among equally terrible and yet uniquely frustrating personalities and ideologies. Isn't that a crazy thing to believe about the group of people who include all of your closest friends and your brother? Keep this statement from Dee in mind. It'll come back later. But first, we should talk about the characters, take a bit of a closer look at what makes them tick, starting with Mac and Charlie. The reason I'm starting with Mac and Charlie is that the other 3 members of the group have a more complex and pre-existing history that should be referenced all at once, despite the fact that every character in this group has a complicated history with every other character. Mac and Charlie, however, are just friends and have never officially considered themselves family. They are also, I think, the most innocent of the members of the group, for all that's worth, which is not much. What Mac and Charlie represent for the show tends to be levels of ignorance, but on different scales. Charlie is one of the more unhinged members of the group, unable to read, with a volatile and unpredictable pattern of emotions, and some truly wild and potentially dangerous systems of beliefs. He, like most members of the group, appears to have been abused to some degree in his history and exhibits symptoms of several disorders, most obviously OCD, which likely came from his mother, who exhibits similar but independent symptoms. When Charlie doesn't understand something, it's usually either because his grip on reality is so warped that he cannot wrap his head around a fundamental part of the concept, or strangely, because his own system of morality disagrees with the concept. In a more recent episode of the series called The Gang Solves Global Warming, Charlie makes himself an outfit made of trash and is motivated primarily by the idea of getting free cat food to eat, and yet seems at least cognizant enough of Dee's hypocritical belief system to actively and knowingly document her treating others poorly so that he can ruin her false image for her fans. When he's called out for this, his response indicates he clearly knew what he was doing, which is baffling. Here's a man who never learned to read and who regularly huffs toxic chemicals to get high, who also recognizes the subtle intricacies of influencer culture in relation to domestic politics? Or was he just trying to embarrass Dee? Here's a man who writes a genuinely impressive, if disjointed musical about his own abuse as a child, who also regularly states his belief in entities like ghouls and leprechauns. I would consider Charlie Kelly a mad genius. However, like every character in this show, there are also scenes which indicate an overwhelming penchant for selfishness and cruelty, a standout of which being Season 8, Episode 4 of the series, Charlie and Dee Find Love, in which Charlie finally seems to get over his obsessive crush on a woman the gang only knows as the waitress, and instead enters what appears to be a healthy and passionate relationship with a rich woman named Ruby Taft, played by Alexandria Daddario. Throughout the episode, the waitress's life gets progressively worse, mostly as a result of the meddling of Frank, and Charlie's life seems to get better and better as his relationship develops with Ruby. However, when the waitress calls Charlie and for the first time ever seems interested in giving any kind of relationship with him a chance, Charlie drops Ruby in an instant, revealing that the whole time he had been using her, that he had never cared for her and in fact found her distasteful, degrading her brutally in front of everyone she knows and abandoning her in tears. It is quite literally one of the cruelest moments from any character in the show, depending on how you measure those things, and it's strange that it comes from a character who is usually more morally cognizant. But then again, of course, Charlie is a wild card. Not the wild card per se, but certainly one of them. But let's talk about Mac now. There is no character, with potentially the exception of Cricket, that I feel more sympathy for than Mac. Not because Mac is a good guy, but because I believe he would have been if not for every other person in his life warping his idea of what religion, politics, sexuality, and identity should look like. Charlie is a force of ignorance because he's insane. Mac is a force of ignorance because of what he believes in. One of the primary characteristics you will find in Mac is an avid desperation to be accepted. His own parents, an impassive chain-smoking mother, and a sociopathic criminal father do not, and clearly have never, extended Mac any kind of tenderness or love, failing to act as good role models legally or socially, and pushing Mac into an identity that seems always shifting and never enough. Mac visits both of his parents a lot, and clearly idolizes them despite their failings. In many scenes does Mac tell his parents or other people he cares about that he loves them, only to be ignored, brushed off, or even told that they don't feel the same. It's heartbreaking, despite some of the foolish and frustrating things Mac does and believes. Mac fills this void of support with religion. However, likely due to his upbringing, he falls into the worst version of this religion, a version that further pushes Mac away from having respect or faith in himself, and also reinforces negative ideas about women, other races and religions, and especially about queer people. A great example of this actually exists over the course of a few seasons, and begins when Mac enters a relationship with a trans woman who has not had bottom surgery in Season 1. Episode 4, Charlie has cancer. He didn't, by the way. Season 1 is a rough season. The jokes are a lot stronger, and the casual racism and transphobia is pretty clear-cut. This style of comedy is addressed in-universe by the creators later as they develop with the times and clearly gain a better understanding of society and the show themselves. I actually think this is how the most compelling narrative, that of Mac's development as an independent man, came to be. Rob McElhenney, the show's creator and actor for Mac, realized that there was a deep pain inherent to the type of hate that Mac perpetuated, and whether intentional from the start or not, the story that pain tells progressively becomes the main arc of Mac's character. Mac is gay, a fact that comes up a couple seasons into the show, despite Mac not actively coming out until Season 12, Episode 6 of the series, Hero or Hate Crime. In the first episode with the trans woman, Carmen, Mac is uncomfortable with how attracted he is to Carmen, especially in the face of her still having male genitalia. In Season 6, Episode 1, Mac re-encounters Carmen after her surgery and also after she's gotten married to a man named Nick. At this point, the idea of Mac's homosexuality has already been brought up a few times, but he is still deeply in denial about it. He tries to use his own shaky understanding of the Bible to shame the two for getting gay married, obviously missing the fundamental concept of Carmen being a woman, and is quickly put in his place when Nick, a black man, utilizes another biblically loaded passage about slave ownership to put Mac's hypocrisy under a spotlight. The worst part is, no matter how you look at this scene, the reason Mac is so aggressively against gayness, women, femininity, it's all because he's been pushed to become a more toxic, hateful version of himself, and the person he's upset with isn't Carmen for not calling him back, or Nick for being with the person he had been pursuing, but himself for not being able to be happy like the people he's constantly criticizing. Is it any wonder that the person Mac truly falls in love with is the person who is most critical and derogatory of his appearance, beliefs, and character? The person who flies off the handle unless he has complete control? The character who, despite a shifting and topical political and moral ideology, is clearly far and away the most evil person to have ever stepped foot in Philadelphia? No, because Mac hates himself, and he's only comfortable with people who hate him too. So let's talk about God. No, not Mac's God, but actually, kind of. More of a golden God.
My form is perfect. I'm like Jerry Rice. Feel that stride. So fluid and fast. I've got the stride of a gazelle. A beautiful, beautiful gazelle person.
Dennis Reynolds. Okay, so Dennis is actually a really easy character to understand. He is evil. And I don't mean he does the most damage of anyone in the group, or that he says the most offensive things. He arguably has more control and capacity for rational thinking than anyone else in the group. No. The reason that I say Dennis Reynolds is evil is because there is no other word to fully describe the quality of this terrible, terrible man. This is the type of person who clearly only cares about the age of consent for legal reasons. A real DiCaprio. A man who actively verbalizes his belief that the best way to ensure sex is to make a woman scared or reliant on you. Who secretly feeds his best friend diet pills because he finds the way he looks distasteful. Who would rather burn a bunch of people alive in his apartment than have an uncomfortable conversation. Who voted for Kanye West in the 2020 election. Who apparently ripped the head off of like 4 birds when he was a little kid. Who abuses the welfare system so he can buy crack. Who takes pleasure in hurting the feelings of his friends even when they're in the hospital. Who sleeps with the person Charlie has been in love with for his entire life despite not really liking the woman. And who uses Mac's gayness as just another point of control. Dennis is not foolishly stumbling into being an asshole. He is kicking the door down and swan diving into serial killer level cruelty. And while he's absolutely responsible for some people's deaths, at least inadvertently, the show even pushes the idea that he has maybe killed people, or at least desperately considered it. Now, was Dennis always like this? Probably not, but maybe. We never really see into his childhood, only hear it referenced, and as stated earlier, like many of the other characters, there are hints of deep trauma. His relationship with his shitty, vapid parents, an instance of SA when he was in high school, a strange, almost Oedipal understanding of mommy-daddy issues. There are indications that Dennis has been hurt just like everyone else. There are also indications, though, that Dennis has been this type of freak his entire life. That in this instance, it's a strange case of nature over nurture. His sister, Dee, is also a pretty actively terrible person and likely experienced a majority of the same events that her brother did, and yet she never seems capable of diving so fully into the depths of depravity that Dennis is capable of, though she gets close. Dee's real issue is not that she's evil, but that she's selfish and possesses zero critical thinking skills. She, much like Dennis, is insistent that she has more to offer than she actually does. She thinks she's a great actress, a great impressionist, and a master of seduction. She is none of these things. Dee is another one of those characters you feel partially bad for because clearly some of her issues stem from anxiety and low self-esteem, which were likely cultivated throughout the course of her childhood with Dennis, who admits in Season 8, Episode 5, that he's been updating a psychological profile on Dee since they were in the 2nd grade. However, despite being comparatively better than Dennis, she is still a bitter and selfish person who is so disappointed by the way her own life has turned out that she takes it out on others. She is an incredibly sexist character, especially later on, as she views progress for women as a whole as somehow a slap in the face to herself, as if, guided by the most chauvinistic forces on Earth, she believes that every other woman is simply competition over a sympathetic or even neutral force. In that same self-sabotaging way, Dee often is the complicating force in the schemes of the other members of the gang. Usually, she's left out of the initial planning, inserts herself, makes a huge mess of things, and then kinda half fails, half flops her way to the conclusion. Usually one that makes her feel or look even worse. The gang bullies her relentlessly, and so she always feels the desperate need to prove herself, despite not really caring about the people she's trying to impress, and tragically, despite their cruelty, the rest of the gang is often right in their criticisms of Dee, and she fails, creating a cycle of plummeting self-esteem and rapidly rising need for approval. Dee isn't evil, she's just desperate, and desperation can push people to do some pretty evil things. Dennis is a different story, though. Dennis is so clearly evil to me because of how often he plays the straight man in any scene, and I mean that in an improv comedy sense, not like a gay way. Dennis's grip on reality 80% of the time is pretty accurate, in at least recognizing other people's insanity, so it feels so much more intentional when he behaves poorly. Ego is a driving force for Dennis, and he often, in moments of extreme frustration or hubris, takes to referring to himself as the Golden God, and everyone around him as idiots or bitches. Dennis is clearly someone who only considers himself, as everyone around him is unimportant, representing only an obstacle on his climb to the top, a climb he never seems to stop making, like Sisyphus with his boulder. So, we've talked about the first 4 members of this group, Mac, Charlie, Dee, and Dennis, and the reason that we talked about them first is because they are the 4 that are clearly being punished in this hell situation, if you'll allow me to bring us back to the larger point this essay is making. Hell is one of those fun concepts, at least if you don't believe in it, because creatively, there are a bunch of different ways to express the idea. Hell is described vaguely in a number of religious texts, in such a way that makes sense within the framework of the legend or narrative it's being described in, but not in a way that makes it universally picturable, and so, over time, a bunch of different creators and groups have come up with a bunch of different interpretations. The one you're probably most familiar with is the fire and brimstone kind, the bubbling pits of lava and imps with pitchforks and a generally red and orange aesthetic. Clearly, if the gang is in hell, that's not the version of it that they're in, so before we talk about the last member of this group and what he represents in this whole dynamic, we should finally start talking about exactly the kind of hell these characters exist in. What are the rules?
What are the rules?
What are the stakes, and how exactly is this an effective punishment for the group? To do this, I'd like to briefly talk about a different show, one that perfectly communicates the core concept of the hell the gang finds themselves in, and that show is called... So, quick spoiler warning. If you haven't watched the entire first season of the show, I'm about to talk about a reveal that recontextualizes everything you see initially, so I definitely recommend watching the first season and hell, the rest of the show when you get the chance, but either way, there's your warning. So, the general premise of The Good Place, both the show and the in-universe location, is that it's a version of the afterlife that isn't tied to any real existing religion, but represents the better side of eternity, hence the name. The Good Place obviously also signifies the existence of a bad place, but in Season 1, we have no real idea what that place would look like, or what truly goes on there, just little snippets of ridiculous, over-the-top torture. The big twist is that the character we follow, a woman named Eleanor, believes that she's been sent to the wrong place, and now needs to either avoid being detected or become an actual good person before the mistake is realized. To do this, she has to work with a bunch of other neurotic and flawed inhabitants of the space, and during your first watch through of Season 1, you may or may not question how they themselves also made it to the good place. But then, during the finale, you realize they didn't. The big reveal of Season 1 is that the good place is actually the bad place, or a new experimental version of it, at least. The other people Eleanor has been interacting with, an anxious philosopher named Chidi, a pretentious socialite named Tahani, and a foolish DJ masquerading as a monk named Jason, are all also being punished for their mistakes on Earth. And that punishment is the stress, fear, anxiety, discomfort, and pain that come from trying to cover their tracks and get by without being noticed. In a fantastic twist, it's revealed that, of course, this isn't heaven. You don't have to deal with this many problems and stressful situations in heaven. Eleanor only didn't notice the behavior of the people around her because she was too focused on herself. It's crazy how comparable this type of punishment is to the one the gang is receiving in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And now is the moment that I have to admit that I'm not the one who made this connection. When I was explaining the concept of this essay to my girlfriend, she was actually the one who pointed out the similarity to The Good Place, a realization that I immediately was disappointed in myself for not having made. Good job, darling. It's a lot like Dee said. Hell is dealing with each other, or in the rare situations where the gang is aligned, dealing with themselves, as confusing as that concept might be. Even when in total agreement, the gang is incredibly prone to self-sabotage and misinterpretation about how to go about reaching their goals. So literally any situation where any members of the group are involved is kind of destined to explode in their face. As I mentioned in the intro to this video, it's kind of ridiculous the amount of insane shit the gang is able to get away with. They blow up a car in the middle of the street with an RPG purchased on the dark web, kidnap and rob several people on St. Patrick's Day, and poison, truly, over the course of the entire show, so many different people in so many different ways, and yet none of them are in prison? In fact, none of them are being hunted for sport? Dee has made herself the enemy of entire races. Mac regularly causes problems for his sociopathic felon father. Charlie is Charlie. It just doesn't seem like the world is responding to the gang in the way that it normally would to a group of people if they were as clearly dangerous and unhinged as our friends from Patty's Pub are. Which leads me back to my premise. This isn't the real world. In the real world, pretty early on in the show, I'll add, the crew would have been broken up through arrests and likely also institutionalizations. And because this group is so toxically linked to each other, in the long term, this separation would almost certainly serve to better the lives of every single person involved in the gang, potentially with the exception of Dennis, whose only real goal ever seems to be dominating, or at least appearing to dominate the rest of the gang. And so obviously, this version of reality, which I'll remind you, is hell, is not going to give that to them, allow them respite from each other. Season 8, Episode 9 of the series, The Gang Dines Out, proves this in quite an interesting way. The plot of this episode is that Mac and Dennis are out having their monthly meal with each other at a restaurant called Gugino's. It's important to them that they spend this time together, and they prefer to do it alone. But again, as I said, hell isn't going to give them that. And so it's revealed over the course of the episode that every other member of the gang is also here, and this fact alone makes it near impossible for any other member of the group to enjoy their meal as they get wrapped up in petty disagreements about respect and power and hierarchy, conversations that seem to happen every episode and in relation to every single problem that arises. How unlikely is it that a group of 5, all operating independently, would somehow all coincidentally choose the same date and time to show up to a restaurant without knowing any of the others would be there? The in-universe explanation is that there's some kind of deal going on, but that doesn't explain the total lack of communication between friends, does it? It wouldn't matter though. If they all decided to go together, as they do in many other episodes, their meal would have inevitably been interrupted by some other insane and deranged situation. I'd like to clarify real quick that I have no idea how the gang died. It doesn't really matter to me. By the first episode of the series, the gang has already illustrated themselves to be deeply flawed and selfish, so whether or not they were alive by this point, I find it very likely that they were already headed downwards. However, I'd be willing to bet that the gang died sometime during or right after Season 1, because of the final crucial element that is added to the show for the first episode of Season 2. An element that many would argue allowed the show to be successful in the first place. Danny DeVito. And of course, by that, I really mean Frank Reynolds, but I just love the man and I wanted to give the actor himself a moment of praise before tearing into his character. In fact, I should do the same for all the creators of the show, but Danny DeVito specifically is a special case. Despite some cruel treatment from audiences who commented heavily about DeVito's appearance and stature, he's always been committed to giving a good performance on stage and creating a good environment off. He's widely regarded as an incredibly kind and thoughtful man, and he's gone out of his way to support the people he works with when they're dealing with tough times. It's nice to hear these things about the people whose work you enjoy, especially in a time when so often people are not who they say they are. Frank Reynolds, however, is a different story, and the reason I decided to bring him up last is because I have a theory. Frank Reynolds is the devil. Now, again, I feel like we're going for a sort of non-specific good place, bad place version of hell, and so in this case, I should clarify. I think Frank is the devil if the devil was also kind of being punished at the same time he was dealing it out, which, now that I think about it, might technically still be biblically accurate, but we're getting too far away from my point. I talked earlier about Charlie being a wild card, but that title absolutely belongs to Frank. It makes sense that the two of them are so close. Their energies together create a force of near unstoppable chaos and insanity. Frank, like 70% of the time, has an insane amount of money that he truly only uses to do weird shit. He could be living on his own in a mansion, but decides to sleep in the same bed as Charlie. He could be weighted on hand and foot, but instead uses a rusty knife to dig out gunk in his toes. He is truly a gremlin of a character, and it's hard to understand why the group keeps him around aside from just his money. Now, why is he the devil? Well, it's specifically the way things work out for Frank versus how they work out for the gang. 9 times out of 10, when the younger members of the gang are working towards a scheme, it blows up in their face, but usually, Frank manages to come out successfully in some way despite the rest of the team's failure. For instance, in Season 11, Episode 3 of the series, The Gang Hits the Slopes, Dennis breaks his legs competing in a competition he thinks is for Frank's benefit, in the hopes that if he wins, Frank will allow him to set up a creepy, rich person ski school. But in fact, this victory means nothing to Frank, who was only hyping up the competition to distract from the fact that he was fracking the mountain. Dennis walks away, or rather crawls away, with nothing but a pair of broken legs, and Frank Reynolds walks away richer. He does this many times, causing panic to promote the sale of guns, taking on management of his old company just to sell it from beneath his employees' feet. Somehow, in a show that is 90% schemes, only one man is capable of actually pulling one off, quite in the same way that the devil is portrayed to be incredibly slippery and good with deals. Now, to clarify, Frank Reynolds is also being punished. His punishments are usually stranger than what the rest of the crew deal with, and that's usually because he does it to himself. When Frank's nose begins bleeding heavily, instead of going to a doctor, he seals up his nose so his face swells up. He regularly eats cat food and drinks beer in the insanely misguided attempt to be healthy, which causes him much gastrointestinal distress, unsurprisingly, and he does a truly unaccountable number of other things that make his own life worse for no reason other than that he's insane. The truth is, Frank's very existence is a punishment for anyone around him, including the gang, other people like Cricket or the waitress, and yes, even himself. He's a curse, an entity that enters your life only to destroy it, then disappear, much like the real devil. In one episode, he breaks into the house of a waiter who saved his life, sends his mother to a terrible nursing home, traps him in debt, then disappears. In another episode, he finds another group of people who have just opened a bar, brings a bunch of underage kids into it, sells them out to the health inspector, causing them to lose the bar and to get fined a ton of money, then he disappears. Under no circumstances is it a good thing to encounter Frank Reynolds. He's like a cryptid or an SCP. And finally, one more piece of evidence. On board the cruise ship, on that very same episode, The Gang Goes to Hell, Frank's crucifix necklace burns his skin. What more proof do you need that this is an unholy man? Did Mac put battery acid on the back of the necklace? Maybe, but I think it just did that. So there we have it. The gang is dead, somehow, and in a hellish afterlife that has taken the shape of some disgusting and terrible fictional city called Philadelphia. Sometimes they leave Philly, not often, but when they do, their misfortune follows them, often in the form of a demonic entity called Frank. Their punishment is not pitchforks and fire, but rather the time they have to spend with each other. A group of people who may have once been friends and family, but who have mutated into tumorous opponents to be constantly insulted and betrayed and leveraged against each other. I guess that maybe the title of the show should be renamed It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And that's how I'm ending this video. Goodbye!